No. John Kurtz is you gotta check out his YouTube channel, especially if you're a Big 12 fan. But we've had John on a lot from the KC area and K-State. John, you have been very outspoken on your thoughts on the Pac-12 right now. When you heard what George Kliavkoff said this morning, what was your initial reaction?
Well, I've got to give him credit. I mean, whoever it was that came up with the line about we haven't decided yet if we're shopping there, whether that was him or whether that was some kind of media consultant or a PR person behind the scenes, tip of the cap. I mean, that I did laugh when I saw that, but I laugh in part because it's one, a good line, but two, does not at all accurately represent reality. I think the reality is if one conference is getting poached out of the two, it's going to be the Pac-12. I don't think the Big 12's in any kind of position to be poached at all right now. That doesn't mean that the Pac-12 is going to be, and it doesn't mean that the Pac-12 necessarily is going to disintegrate right now. But I think everybody knows what the situation is. And the reality of the situation is that today, I think the bigger thing that happened, other than George Kliavkoff's comments and the fact that he clearly seemed threatened, I thought, just by the tone of all of the comments that he had. The bigger news to me is that Oregon's athletic director came out today and would not commit to saying that they would sign away their grant of rights, and instead was talking about, hey, short-term contracts are better for business. I think that's along the lines of the comments from Kevin Warren earlier this week. Another thing that is going to take some stability away rather from the Pac-12 right now. So I guess I would say kudos George for a good one-liner, but I don't think that's changing the reality of the situation. And I think the biggest problem facing the Pac-12 is it's not TV. It's not necessarily TV dollars, although that's a part of it. The problem is the stabilization of the conference and not being able to get Oregon or Washington or, heck, now Cal or Stanford, after what we learned earlier this week about the Big Ten's wish list, to sign away their grant of rights for any kind of period of time. And I just feel like in Pac-12 country, that whole task has been kind of minimized in terms of its importance and difficulty. And I think that's the real impasse that the Big 12, Big 12 Twitter and Pac-12 Twitter, whatever Pac-12 Twitter is, I think that's kind of the impasse that everybody's at right now.
Yeah. When you said, what the Oregon athletic director said that or president said that the, shorter contracts are better for business, all I hear is Jim Phillips going, well, we know in the ACC. We know that they're better for business. We know that we have one for 100 years. We get it. We know. We've heard it all. But going back to the Big 12 versus the Pac-12, one of the things, John, I think is that, and I said this earlier on the show this week, is that the Big 12 is in a stronger position right now because they've already reinvented themselves. They've already started a new thing, which is the only thing they could have done. They could not ever be what they were again, and with Texas and Oklahoma gone, so they reinvented themselves into a new thing that has growth potential with schools like Houston and UCF and Cincinnati and BYU, who have maybe more concentrated fan bases, not all over the place except for BYU, but in the places they are, and big alumni groups. As for the Pac-12, they've lost LA. There's no way to get it back. You can't reinvent Los Angeles. There's not another television market you can go grab that will do that again. So that's why, to me, I feel like they are swimming a little upstream, because you can't reinvent, or you can't hit reboot anymore, and you can't really reinvent yourself into something that's on par with anything else.
Yeah, well, I mean, just remember, I saw Max Olson tweeted, hey, last year Bob Bowlesby accused ESPN of trying to destabilize his conference. A year later, it's George Kliavkoff accusing the Big 12 of trying to destabilize his conference. I mean, they are in the same position the Big 12 was in pre-adding the 4 schools that were added last year, which it's easy to forget, but that was a crazy time where there was no feeling of stability at all for anybody in the Big 12. I mean, that's where the Pac-12 is at right now, and I still don't see the route where you get Oregon and Washington. They're going to have to come up with something pretty creative to find some deal that satisfies everybody in terms of a dollar payout, satisfies everybody in terms of what the revenue share is going to be, if it's going to be unequal and tilted towards the top 4 there in the conference. Will everybody else be happy with it? And I just don't see what the path is to actually making that happen. And everybody right now is out for their own interest. That's another thing we remember about a year ago in the Big 12. Everybody talking about where can we wind up? Oklahoma State was out here. Robert Allen, who does a great job covering Oklahoma State, was out here talking about We talk to every single other Power 5 conference that's out there. I mean, like, that's the mode that the Pac-12 is in right now. And that is, once that toothpaste comes out of the tube, man, it's really hard to put that back in. So I get when Stuart Mandel or John Wilner try to tell us, like, hey, it's not like the Big 12 is worth that much more as an entity, if more at all, to TV networks. And in a vacuum, okay, fine, I can get on board with that and I can agree, but let's call it relatively equal, okay? And shout out to Sam Bradshaw, by the way, for the work that he did, once again, cleaning up Stuart's mess on the TV numbers. But even with all of that put aside, like, this is not occurring in a vacuum. The situation for the Pac-12 is that if you're in Arizona, you could look at this and say, well, the money's about equal here, but I can go to a league that knows what they are, has that new identity you talked about, and is stable, make the same or more money now if I can bring other teams with me, and we can take over that after dark spot where it can be Big 12 after dark. If you have, say, 5 teams in that time zone as opposed to just the one right now in BYU, well, now you can use that Pac-12 after dark point against the Pac-12 and say, well, we can take that over. We can get that spot that almost guarantees you 1 million or 1.2 million viewers, no matter who it is that's playing there. And now all of a sudden we have the stability, we have a little bit more money, and we don't have to worry about all the infighting and everything that's going on in the Pac-12 while we sit around and bow at the altar of Oregon and Washington. So I think, like, that's just the reality of the situation, and I feel like that's being missed. And some of that is that people don't argue it correctly, I think, from the Big 12 side when we get really excited and want to tout what this league is, which I'm all about, but I don't think the Big 12 is worth millions and millions and millions more than the Pac-12 right now. But I think it's everything that I just laid out that makes the difference, and that's why the Big 12 is in a position of power. There's a difference between being in a more stable position and a position of power versus simply just being worth more money in a vacuum.
Yeah, and look, the Big Ten actually, shot a little arrow through that after dark thing, basically saying, like, you bet we're going to do it too, because now they have 2 schools over there. Now, I don't think that they're going to, make them all, play 6 home games at 9 o'clock, but I do think that it's going to be pretty much out there. So then even if you're still doing Pac-12 after dark, there could be a better game, USC and, say, Wisconsin on at that same time than what you're touting out there. So right now, you better hope that nobody else goes into that 9:30 time slot. You probably shouldn't have said anything about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the funny part about that is USC may not be playing 9 o'clock home kickoffs. UCLA might be playing 6 9 o'clock home kickoffs every single year to try and fulfill that for the Big Ten. But you're right. And I mean, this is another advantage, another box checked by the Big 12 is just the flexibility in that. Like, yes, if you get the 4 corner schools or sub out San Diego State for one of them, whichever route that you want to go, you'll have some of that covered, but you also have all the way over to everybody in the Eastern time zone within the conference. So you have literally the entire day covered. So yes, the Pac-12 does have that advantage somewhat, but it's going to be neutralized by the Big Ten and the way that they're moving. And then on top of that, the Big 12 can offer TV networks the flexibility of being able to be on all day, literally all day, 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. with the kick times. And that definitely is something that holds value when it comes to TV.
Do you think that it would be better for the Pac-12 and Big 12 and ACC to remain the same and hope that this stops it? Or is that naive to think that would even hold here in the next couple of years?
Man, that's such a tough question. Like, I had such a mixed reaction to the Big Ten press conference earlier this week, Kevin Warren's press conference, where on one hand, when he kind of leaves the door cracked open for further expansion and certainly didn't shut it, certainly did not provide stabilizing comments to the college football landscape. On one hand, I'm excited, and I'm like, okay, I think this ramps up the chances of the Big 12 being the conference that collects basically the best of the rest, right? And I think that's the hope right now is that eventually, whenever this thing all sorts itself out, there will be the 2 mega conferences, but then you'll get the best of the rest. And we're talking about scooping up some of the ACC too. And I think, all right, I feel like that got us a step closer. But you're also kind of playing with fire because at what point then maybe it gets to eventually the Big Ten and or SEC. They're going to take a couple of schools from the Big 12 and just completely blow the whole thing up, and it'll literally be just those 2. And certainly myself, this is where it comes into being a K-State fan, K-State grad, somebody that covered the team for 10 years. Obviously, I care deeply about it, and I worry then in that standpoint, like where K-State winds up and all of that. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Like, I feel like where the Big Ten's at, and that sort of relates back to your question in general. I don't totally know. I don't totally know what the answer is to that right now. I just know that Kevin Warren is a guy that does not seem real concerned with that, whereas in the SEC, I mean, Greg Sankey actually seemed like he was. And some of the reporting, the Saturday Down South report in particular, where they came out and said, like, hey, look, we understand the viability of college football is important for the viability of us. This has to be a legitimate product nationally that people are still really interested in for us to continue to make money. And that seemed to me to be a really a very wise statement from the Pac-12, or excuse me, the SEC. Rather, the Big Ten now, on the other hand, is kind of like, look, we're gonna conquer. We're gonna go do what we have to do to look out for us, and not be Sears and Roebuck. Roebuck? I don't know. That was a new one for me to learn.
Yeah, they're trying to be Amazon. That's what they're trying to be. You know?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
be a big giant. But if you do want a 16-team playoff, that's also kind of speaking out of both sides of your mouth, in that you could say, like, look, we'd like to be Amazon, but if we realize nobody else really is going to get out of the way enough to let us do that, we can always go to 16-team playoff. And then that makes, a lot of teams feel better, even though whatever playoff is designed is going to be designed to get, of those 16 teams, 6 to 8 of them will be from those two leagues.
Yeah, the 16-team play, I'll be honest, that one really caught me off guard. I was not expecting to hear about that. And, the Big Ten was a part of the alliance, which some of what we heard from the alliance in killing the idea of the 12-team playoff. Now, I kind of knew at the time we were hearing this has to just be an excuse or something being thrown out right now for whatever the real reasoning is. But, we heard about player safety and not wanting to play extra games. Well, what are you doing with a 16-team playoff then? I mean, just creating more games and creating more scenarios for more teams to be playing that 15th or 16th or whatever game on their schedule. So, yeah, that was a new one to me, and that's another one where I have to kind of think really long and hard about, all right, like how would that affect the Big 12? I guess on one hand, more playoff spots would be better, but what does that mean for everything else, the mechanisms that are happening and developing around that too? And then could you get the SEC on board with that? I don't know. That opened up, I think, a whole new can of worms to discuss, but it's kind of getting overshadowed, obviously, because realignment is in the not in the rearview mirror. That's more in the rearview mirror. Everything else is front and center, which is realignment.
I think, though, with a 16-team playoff, you could, the way you sell it, if you're everybody who's not the SEC and Big Ten is, like, you guys are going to get more. Like, it's not us. Like, you need to kind of undersell it. Like, it's not us. It's great for us. It's even better for you. Like, stop trying to, like, for them, stop trying to tell them that, like, you're as good as them and just admit what they want to hear. Like, just, it's good for you. You'll get more. Everybody's going to be happy here. You can be world dominant and we can still be a part of it. Like, that's the way they have to sell it. Whether they feel that way or not, sometimes you just have to, swallow your pride.
Yeah, and what triggers in my brain when you say that is, like, this is where I'm glad that the Big 12 has Brett Yormark, because I think he's the kind of guy that can understand things like that and will understand, Kevin Warren's the one that even called him like a marketing guru, genius. I can't remember what the specific terminology was that he used. Again, there's been so many quotes from this week, but a guy that understands marketing and understands how to utilize this league now. The appropriate way to go about this is not to take the Jim Phillips route from the ACC and be like, man, wasn't it great 10, 20 years ago, the way this all used to be? I mean, you can't be thinking about that right now, and you can't be thinking about it like that right now. And if you're the Big 12, you have to brand yourself as different and alternative to it. You can't try to play the same game, right, as the Big 10 and the SEC with what they're doing now. So I think these are kind of like ideas adjacent to each other, but that's what really goes off in my brain is I love the fact that I think Yormark will not try to do things like that. He will try to be different, and he will try to carve out a new niche for the Big 12 right now and be very aggressive in doing so.
John, all this, and normally we'd have you on to talk about K-State. We haven't really get into the prospects of the season. We're a month away. Like, we've got so much other to deal with before somebody actually takes a snap.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking, like, when the USC-UCLA story broke, I was like, man, July was supposed to be like the quiet month of the calendar. You can rest, relax a little bit, maybe take some vacation, and instead now we're just thrust back full tilt into it. But hey, I'm here for it. It's going to keep us very entertained up until the season. It definitely helps kill some of the doldrums of summer here. And I tell you what, if not for realignment, I'd be really focused on what's happening with the upcoming season, because I think this is going to be the best team that K-State has had, certainly under Chris Klieman, and probably the best team right now. It seems like on paper since 2014, which was a 9-win K-State team that actually went to Waco on the last day of the regular season and played a game in front of College Game Day that would determine the Big 12 championship there. K-State still had a shot at a share of the Big 12 title with winning that game. I mean, a lot of it's going to hinge with K-State on Adrian Martinez, obviously, because I think a lot of the other pieces are in place. We know about Deuce Vaughn. They've got a potential All-American, Cooper Beebe, on the offensive line. They've got a potential All-American pass rusher in Felix Anyudike-Uzama. I think they've got a great first 22. Depth might start to become more of a concern, but there is a lot of optimism in Manhattan because of that. And the optimism with Adrian Martinez is he played in front of arguably the worst Power 5 offensive line in the country last year at Nebraska. And really, if you look at the analytics on it, I don't think it's arguable. He's got a much better offensive line. He's got somebody that can shoulder the load in terms of running the ball, obviously, and Deuce. And new offensive coordinator and just fresh faces all around him. I think that was a situation at Nebraska that had turned kind of toxic. And there's ever a scenario where you just need a change of scenery, I think that was it for Adrian Martinez, and probably, frankly, for Nebraska, too, on the other side of it. So, if he can be anywhere close to what he was touted to be coming out of high school, I think K-State's going to have a really good team this year. And, the expectation around here is kind of, I would say, to take a step beyond what they've peaked at under Klieman, which has been an 8-win team. So I think it's, can you get to 9? Can you get to 10? And if you do, then obviously you should be in contention for the Big 12 championship game. So I'm thrilled about it. K-State's also recruiting as well for their 2023 recruiting class that they have under Klieman. It just feels like a lot of things are starting to turn a corner. Unfortunately, the thing hanging over everything is like you always have to be in the back of your mind concerned about realignment and where that's going and how that's going to affect things. But there is a lot of momentum in Manhattan right now for sure.
I think you kind of share my opinion on Adrian Martinez, and I think that he and Scott Frost were bad for each other, but not bad overall. That relationship just was not going to work. In that Scott Frost maybe got a little too greedy with Adrian Martinez's athletic ability and didn't take the time to maybe coach some of the things out of him that Chris Klieman probably did on day one, which is you're not going to turn the ball over like you did before because we're not going to put you in that position.
Yeah, and K-State's been pretty good with that. With the caveat again, when Skylar Thompson played quarterback. Now, Will Howard, when they had to go to him, he's been kind of a turnover machine. But there's a track record there of taking care of the football. Skylar did that really well, and he was better at it under Klieman than he was under Bill Snyder. So that's a positive. You also just look at the general history of Klieman working with quarterbacks. His last 3 starting quarterbacks are all playing in the NFL. Skylar Thompson was drafted in the 7th round by the Miami Dolphins. Looks like he has a good chance to back up Tua this year. Easton Stick is still in the NFL with the Chargers. And then obviously before that, we know about Carson Wentz. And in between there, he recruited and spent some time coaching Trey Lance, who's obviously in the NFL as well. So, I mean, there's quietly a very good track record of Chris Klieman working with quarterbacks. I think another X factor here is going to be how does Colin Klein do when the Bullets are actually flying as the offensive coordinator? Offense looked great against LSU, which was his debut as the interim OC, but look, I'll be honest with you. I mean, that was an extremely depleted LSU team. I don't know that you can take a ton from it, but it certainly did provide some hope and some momentum for him to get the job. So assuming that, he is what K-State fans think he will be, we all feel like he's a pretty bright, young offensive mind, then, yeah, I think the sky really is the limit in terms of potential there. It felt like, we all know that couple that it's just bad for each other. I mean, going through my head I can think of a couple going through my head as you were saying that. And it's like, they may be perfectly fine on their own, and you may even want to date one of them on your own. But when they get together, it's like oil and water. It just doesn't mix. It's not very good. And I think that's probably the case with both of those guys.
Yeah, I think so. Hey, I've got a quick story to tell you about Colin Klein. When he was, and it was that year in Waco that they lost, but he was a Heisman Trophy candidate. And the Heisman Trophy campaign was Kansas State sent out these Band-Aids because he wore a Band-Aid on his face. So they sent out these Band-Aids. I had that in my house for 10 years. That there 9, whatever it was, turned 2013, whatever that year was, but like 9 years. My fiance moved into my house last year. She is a Kansas grad. It was up in my office with all the rest of my sports memorabilia. She comes up there and she goes, "Why do you have this?" And I said, "Well, they sent it to me. I thought it was a cool thing. It's a Heisman Trophy. Like a lot of these things are unoriginal, and like this was great." And it was immediately in the trash. I have no idea where it is. It's gone. There's not a hill I was going to die on.
Wow, you didn't even use the Band-Aid? I mean, at least you could have used it.
Yeah, actually, yeah. Well, I mean, again, it probably would have been because she threw the case at me. But yeah, she's like, "No."
Yeah, no, that's good. And actually, it makes me happy that somebody still remembers the Band-Aid because that was a phenomenal marketing idea. And Bill Snyder, for all that he was excellent at, never the greatest marketing guy because he just didn't care. And that was one of those things. I was like, you know what? kudos, K-State. That was a hell of a marketing gimmick to help out Colin Klein there.
Yeah, do you know how many stupid just postcards I've gotten over the years? Like, come on, Band-Aids. That's something then it was great. Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, John, thanks so much for hopping on. Enjoy your stuff on YouTube. Follow him on Twitter. Go to the YouTube channel, all that stuff. John Kurtz with us here on Sikkim 365 Radio and 365 Sports.